And with that, Piera, we will hand it over to you.
All right. Hopefully everybody can see the screen. Since I can't, and just shout if you can't see it. I was asked to talk about third-party certification of firewood. This is kind of a new direction for the National Plant Board, and so this is pulled together with some early information. It came up during a board of directors call probably only 6 weeks or so ago, and we put together kind of an ad hoc work group. I hesitate to even call it a committee at this point, to start exploring what third-party firewood certification would look like and its acceptability to the states. And so the folks that were involved with that ad hoc group were myself, Ann Gibbs, Scott Shermer, and Megan Abraham. So what I'm going to cover today in the talk is just some brief background, review of the National Plant Board Firewood Guidelines, challenges and opportunities in firewood certification of heat-treated firewood, some of the goals, the initial goals that the group put together. We did do a survey monkey survey of National Plant Board members as to whether or not they would allow entry of firewood certified by third parties into their state. We had reasonable participation. We had 23 folks that responded. And then kind of what I see as the next steps. And there's a lot of opportunity here for comment and thought and direction moving with this. So what's the background? Basically, the EAB federal quarantine served as kind of a de facto firewood regulation for many states. And so the deregulation of EAB then eliminated those de facto quarantines, as well as the USDA firewood certification programs in several states. And I want to be real clear that the USDA continues to provide support for state firewood certification programs, but there are states with authorities that don't allow them to certify firewood, and other limitations which may not allow them to certify firewood. And because of this absence of a nationwide firewood standard or nationwide firewood certification program or consistent requirements for a certification program, it can create some real challenges in a very complex landscape for heat treatment facilities that are shipping interstate. And it can also create some regulatory challenges for both shipping states and receiving states. So when the USDA was considering deregulation of EAB, they reached out to the National Plant Board about how to kind of manage the interstate shipment of firewood. And National Plant Board members indicated a preference for a set of guidelines that would explore and assist in crafting a state-by-state response to the firewood pathway without necessarily requiring it. And so we've done presentations on this in the past, and so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But just as an overview, the National Plant Board Firewood Guidelines provide firewood references to states. They suggest best practices for states in the areas of regulation, outreach strategies, best management practices. And the goal was to make information available to states to promote and enable, but not to require a more unified approach to the firewood pathway. And there were a lot of people that worked on drafting these guidelines as well as reviewing them. And the products that came out of this were a very long Word document or PDF entailing all the components of the effort. And then the USDA was generous to provide funding to basically create a firewood guidelines website, which is much sexier than the very long document that was created. And it really makes it easy to kind of drill down into these different
down here.
Okay, to drill down into the different portions of the guidelines. And I wanted to point out, for the purposes of this presentation, that we actually have a section in the guidelines and on the website on certification programs. And it's basically, like the rest of the guidelines, providing context for states and some guidance for states if they wanted to run a certification program, some pros, some cons. And it's a good starting point for this conversation, quite frankly. And so I would encourage people to look at that website. But of course, if the states have limitations, including a limitation on their authorities, then their heat treatment kilns in their states need some support for certification that they can't maybe give them. So there's some challenges and some opportunities here. And so previously USDA certified heat treatment facilities may be in states which do not offer firewood certification. And this can create some supply chain problems given where they may have historically sold their product through, as well as compliance concerns. So because we do not have a new approved common name for Lymantria dispar, I will, in the interest of being friendly about it, refer to the standard for the 54 for 30 as the GM LDD standard throughout the presentation. And so what I wanted to say is that USDA certification to that GM LDD standard may not meet state heat treatment entry requirements. And certification of heat treated firewood, particularly the calibration of the kilns, can require state staff time, which is already limited due to compounding responsibilities. And there's a real opportunity here for potentially third-party kiln calibration or certification of firewood to address some of these challenges, as long as that third-party certification was accepted by the receiving states. So the primary goal here is, would third-party certified heat treatment firewood be allowed entry by receiving states? And some sub-questions to this are, can or are receiving states willing to allow entry of third-party certified heat treatment firewood as the regulations are currently written? We wanted to have a narrow focus on the process for firewood certification and not really get embroiled in a discussion about firewood standards. So we thought we could maybe get agreement on process. We wanted to, through this effort, maybe encourage use of consistent labeling, encourage harmonizing agreement language for any kind of agreements with third-party certifiers. And to this end, we sent a survey to the National Plant Board membership. And now my screen is frozen. Wonderful. So anyway, we had some pretty good response on that survey. There were 23 different states that did respond. We had good representation across the states. There were 8 states from the Eastern Plant Board that responded. There were 5 states each from Central Plant Board and Southern Plant Board and Western Plant Board. There is a need for certification of firewood because about 2/3 of the responding states indicated that they have a firewood regulation in place or are considering putting a firewood regulation in place. I'm going to run out of the ability of things to talk about here without my slides advancing. And I would say, in summary, states are very open and to considering accepting third-party certified firewood. They're open to modifying existing regulations where regulations preclude the ability to allow third-party certified firewood, because some of the states do require the firewood to be certified by a state or a federal agency. And they would want to see that the third-party certifier is meeting an agreed-upon set of standards in order to meet those requirements. Let's see. There we go. So states with firewood regulations are receptive to third-party certified heat-treated firewood when there are periodic audits of the process, preferably overseen by the source state regulatory agency. The certification process includes product labeling standards, maintenance of temperature and duration records for heat treatment chamber and wood probes, calibration of heat treatment chamber monitoring probes, and segregation of treated and untreated firewood. Some states would also require, as per this survey, a compliance agreement with the certifier, that heat treatment firewood is safeguarded from infestation or contamination, as well as maintenance of customer and delivery records. So as I said, there was broad participation across the National Plant Board. The responses from states with and without firewood regulations, 13 have an existing regulation, 3 are considering regulating, and 7 do not regulate firewood. The gypsy moth, Lymantria dispar heat treatment standard of 56C for 30 minutes is not adequate to meet state entry requirements for any of the states that participated in the survey. 9 of the states require the former EAB standard of 60 for 60, and 5 of the states require the ALB standard at 71.1C for 75 minutes. 2/3 of the states require state or federal certification, but a majority of respondees said that they would consider regulatory changes to allow third-party certified firewood entry if there was oversight of the third-party certifier and the process met standards. Members, even those who are currently certifying firewood, were largely interested in utilizing third-party firewood certification in their states. That was dependent upon whether or not receiving states would allow entry of that firewood. In states that indicated that they would not utilize a third-party certifier, basically indicated that they had very few kilns in their state that required certification, and that they had some sort of cost recovery for inspector certification time in place. So we asked about different best management practices that the states would want to see as part of a third-party certification of firewood. And they basically, most states wanted to see these states maintaining, well, they wanted to see the kilns maintaining treatment, chamber, and wood temperature records, as well as meeting product labeling standards. A large number, 3/4, also wanted to see calibration of the heat treatment chamber monitoring equipment. Nearly 3/4 wanted to see segregation of treated and untreated material. Fewer were interested in safeguarding heat treated firewood from reinfestation or contamination, or maintaining customer and delivery records. And only about half wanted to maintain firewood source records. 3/4 would require periodic audits as part of the process, preferably overseen by the source state regulatory agency, and about half would want the third-party certifier to be under compliance agreement. So there was the opportunity to provide other comments during the survey as well, and there were some questions about whether or not kilns would be able to pay the cost for third-party certification and who would bear the cost. There was a comment that equipment calibration was a really good role for third-party certification, and that the makers of the firewood kilns and temperature monitoring equipment are probably better positioned to calibrate equipment than the states. There was some discussion about, kilns that are more modern, like those supplied by Kiln Direct, and their consistency and ability to meet those higher heat treatment standard, and whether or not more of a DIY kiln would need a different approach and more oversight. There was some discussion about needing to establish minimum standards for certification process, as well as a checklist to make sure that there's consistency between third-party certifiers, and that the certification process for meeting the heat treatment standards may not necessarily meet all states' labeling and entry requirements. So next steps from this preliminary information that we got from the states are that first, that survey is still open, and I will send out the link again to the National Plant Board members if there are other states that want an opportunity to provide guidance to help inform any future efforts on this. It sounds like from the feedback we got from the states is that we need to develop a firewood certification process, including a checklist, develop a compliance agreement template, then present the guidance to the membership, and then develop a communication plan to third-party certifiers about conditions under which states would allow entry of heat-treated firewood. And that is all I had. So I'm happy to take any questions.
I don't see any questions in the chat area. Does anybody have any quick questions?
Piera, this is Lee Greenwood. Can you hear me okay?
I can, Lee. It's nice to hear from you.
Hi. So my question is there the potential for a regional or national third-party certification, as this would be sort of a decentralized private decision to become a certified entity? Or are you thinking that there would be like per state? I'm just curious if you have a vision on the scale of a potential third-party certification entity.
Right. And so the backstory on this is that a third-party certifier reached out to us about what it would take for him to be able to certify a large distributor who is in a state without a certification program. And so I think my initial approach to this really is that you know, some of these larger timber certification companies that are already providing certification processes for, like, say, wood packing material would maybe be able to operate in multiple states and be sending to multiple states. But you always ask very tough questions ahead of where I'm thinking at the moment, so I don't really have an answer for you right now. Sorry.
Oh no, that's completely fine. I guess, so I hadn't even thought about the National Lumber Standards Associations and entities, but those would be, in theory, a really natural match for this need. And
Yes.
I am interested to think that through conceptually, because they are already familiar with both domestic and international needs on things like kiln drying and heat treating.
Yes.
So that is a really interesting thought. Thanks so much for a really good presentation, Piera.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Piera.